Terrific. Hi. So, Peter, you may remember me from mere moments ago. Just like to introduce our panel. So you've already heard from Michelle, of course, but would love to hear just a quick intro from everybody, if you don't mind, and just which company you're with and what you do there. So, Dan, if you don't mind starting.
Thanks so much, Peter. So my name is Dan Zhandler. I spent most of the last 5 years building a fashion e-commerce marketplace called Spring, where you can shop from brands large and small, as large as Nike and Michael Kors, as small as single shop Nolita New York type brands. So figuring out payments flows across that, and then just as of a week ago, I've just joined Uber. So excited to tackle some more scale through that.
So my name is Matthias. I work at PAYMENTSfn, which is something difficult to pronounce in English. I found out. We started as a food delivery company, but right now we are delivering anything. We are not trying to compete with Amazon, but we started with pharmacy that I heard about someone talking about that, electronics and anything in the future. So we started with payments 3 years ago, and it's a huge topic for us.
Hi, everyone. Michelle Vautier. I'm the Vice President of Payments and Risk at Patreon. And for whoever wasn't here this morning, Patreon's a membership platform for artists and creators. And so I'm focusing on scaling and bringing them globally, both from a pay-in and a payout standpoint.
Hi, I'm Fareed. I've been in the payments industry for a long time. Most recently helping Ola scale payments as they expand globally for both payments and fraud.
Terrific. Well, thanks everybody. And like I mentioned before, definitely glad to take questions from the audience. So feel free to raise your hand or just simply email me at pm@spreedly. Dan, I'd like to start with you actually. So a lot of our conversations have been about merchants and also about marketplaces, and your experience has been specifically in the last 5 years around marketplaces. So when we're talking about scaling payments, what unique characteristics do you see for scaling payments within marketplaces?
So I think when building a marketplace, one of the trickiest considerations is to figure out how much leverage you have over your suppliers. I think you think about one extreme where you have individuals are your suppliers. Maybe you have a car driver who's acting for themselves. At the other extreme, you have Nike, right? You have these $100 billion organizations. And I think figuring out how are you going to get money from your customer and then get it then to that merchant partner and how much work is required from that partner. And so I think for us in the beginning, bringing on the smaller merchants, it was really easy to say, you know what, let's just do merchant onboarding. I think this morning it might have been Carrie talking about how easy merchant onboarding has gotten if they're willing to do it. But then as you start getting into bigger and bigger suppliers, right, you might be starting to run into some of those organizational roadblocks where they're not actually willing, even if it's easy, there's still internal politics or organizational challenges. So actually for us scaling, one of the biggest challenges was how can we have a payments infrastructure that allows us to onboard the big enterprise suppliers without necessarily having to wait for their own internal organizational approvals to go through. And so figuring out sort of creative workarounds through issuing virtual credit cards and so on, which if the conversation goes there, we can talk more about.
Okay, great. So Michelle, actually, I was thinking a little bit about that with that in a marketplace model where you have creators and artists on one side. Did you have to, was there any kind of education process where you had to educate the artists and creators on payments and the importance of that? Or did Patreon in general have to do that in order to get the two sides of the market, if you will?
Yeah, so I think the way we think about it is we actually control the whole payment checkout experience for creators. So the patron experience is completely divided from the creator experience. And so it's been a challenge from a payout standpoint, because what we do is we have 3 different options for payouts. So we offer USACH, we offer PayPal, and we offer Payoneer. And then we just educate them on their pricing, on the different pricing models and different limits, and et cetera, and then let them choose. In the beginning, we just put the logos up and just go for it. And then we were like, oh, they have so many questions. They've never done this before. How do we also understand that onboarding experience for them? Because we've kind of push it off to our partners. And so now we started building help center articles, screenshots, understanding that experience, and starting to own that experience a little bit more, and streamlining it from a Patreon perspective. And so it's been an evolution. We're still not done. Nowhere near.
Right. Okay, great.
Yeah.
So Matthias and Java, I imagine you have similar scenarios too, where you've got multiple sides. With the delivery side, you have a restaurant, say, you've got the deliverer, and also the recipient, the consumer themselves. So how do you deal with that, where there's maybe three sides to the market?
Yeah, exactly. It's been like a huge travel, actually internally and externally. Internally in the company, we had to educate, and I'm saying educate not because I knew about it. First I learned, and then I tried to educate. For example, something as obvious as talking about the customer support people in the company. Do not ask for the credit card number by phone, please. That's that's an example of things that we had to talk about inside the company. And yeah, then you have externally in LATAM, as Catherine was talking about, everything is new and everything is not so trusted. So you have to talk with restaurants and assure they're going to have the money someday. Yeah, actually, for most cases, it's in the next day, but they don't trust it. They want the money right now. I mean, for years and years, they delivered food and got the money directly from the client. And actually, the rider, the deliverer, was an employee of their company, or of the restaurant. So now that we are offering the whole platform, it's a huge job for us to convince them. We have also an onboarding process for restaurants, because we have to explain how they are going to get the money, how the orders come, how we manage the order modification, for example. And yeah, it's a huge process that involves a lot of learning from multiple sides. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, very interesting insights from everybody. In fact, my answer is slightly technical and kind of goes back to what Catherine was alluding to earlier, is scaling payments globally, especially if you look at it from an international perspective, is making sure that you support multiple payment methods. I think that's a big one. It's also ensuring that your downstream providers can scale with you. Too often when you launch as a new startup, you go with whoever's willing to accept you, right? Because there's not a lot of bargaining, and the classic acquirer ISO is not going to touch you. Or maybe you have. I remember Amazon Payments was the only one that supported Kickstarter when they started, because nobody wanted to take on the risk of a crowdfunding platform. So I think as startup ecosystems evolve, you're going to find that you typically sign up with somebody who's willing to take you on, and then you also sometimes outgrow them, right? So it's important to make sure that your downstream partners are able to scale with you. I think that's an important aspect that I would like to throw out.
Sorry, I would add that they are able and they want to. Because something that happened too much for us is that the infrastructure in many countries, in Uruguay or small countries, they don't want to, they don't need to, because they have like a mindset of this is what we have and this is what we need. So you have to convince, like you were saying previously, with the Mexican gateways or providers, we still are not able to convince that recurring payments are something that they need. They say like, no, we don't have that. Just call me once a month, and,
right.
and you have to live with it.
We can team up on a strategy for that.
building teams one panel at a time. I like it. Yeah, that's great. So,
just to add to that, I think the other thing that I think from a money angle that you need to take care of is try and make sure that you get settled sooner than is the norm, because this is an area where you do run into cash flow issues as you scale. So it depends on managing that settlement window very well.
Great, yeah, and that settlement plays into the idea of trust. I know, Matthias, you were speaking to trust. Dan, when you're thinking about the marketplace that you built at Spring, how important was that building of trust at the beginning between buyers and sellers, or with the sellers in particular?
Yeah, I think I'm sorry, I'm still hanging on Fareed's last word about cash flow because you've just taken me back to a lot of PTSD on that front. Because I think when with trust this comes in as well, right? Merchants want to get paid before they ship something, and so there's different ways that you can satisfy that. But as a marketplace, you have to figure out how much risk are you willing to take on, how much are you willing to intermediate that transaction, right? Because you want to create the great experience for the customer on the one side, where they know they're going to have a consistent phone number to call for support, or they have an email address. They don't want to necessarily go directly to 1,500 different merchants that are selling. But on the merchant side, most of them aren't going to ship until they have that money. So, for example, can you afford to do auth and capture after ship as a marketplace? That's something that we actually 2 years in changed our point of view on. Right, we started by saying to our supplier partners that they should ship and then we'll capture. Ultimately, we needed to sort of change that to capture upfront because we were losing auths. We were having chargebacks happen later, and they were asking, well, hold on, how come I have this happen? So I think managing that cash flow and then also managing that trust together were really tightly linked for us.
If I can get on that train, I'll also kind of share a story around trust and cash flow. So I think I mentioned earlier, we process payments on the 1st of the month. So 100% of our payments are processed on the 1st of the month, our renewals. Our creators, over the last 5-6 years, have started to depend more and more on the income they earn on our platform as kind of their paycheck. Most of these artists were monetizing in different areas, has consolidated a lot of that within Patreon. So the way our team thinks about it is, this is our creator's paycheck. So we process payments on the 1st, and then we auto pay out on the 5th of the month on your balance, essentially. And that's kind of the order of operation. But if you're a creator and you want to pay out on the 2nd or the 3rd, you can. But we say, hey, we process on the 1st. On the 5th, we feel like we've run at least 2 rounds of retries. It's pretty solid. By the 15th of the month, it's like very small percentage change of what we're going to capture. And obviously, by the end of the month, we finished our retry strategy. So that's kind of what we usually tell our creators. So on February 1st, I don't know if some of you remember, right before that, a few weeks before that, MySQL had an update. And we use MySQL to run our databases. And so we wake up on January 31st, and we start doing all our bill aggregation process. We aggregate all our bills, we get them ready for processing, and Feb 1st, we start processing. Well, we noticed that our bill aggregation is lagging. We're like, oh, that's weird. This is usually done in a 2-hour process. It's been 4, 5, 6 hours. It's still not done. Oh, shit. We are not going to make the 1st. And so it got to a point where if we couldn't have processed all our payments before the 5th, we essentially did not make good on our promise to our creators, and this is their paycheck. Imagine what I told the company. I was like, imagine if I just forgot to press the payroll button and none of you got paid. That's not cool, right? And so what we had to do is we quickly realized there was an issue with our database scaling. Big issue in scaling. It was some issues on our side, some issues on the MySQL update. There was just a lot of calamity of events that happened. And so what we had to do is build an advanced payout tool overnight. So my engineering team and product team spent exactly 24 hours building an advanced payout tool. And what we did is we estimated 90% of what we think they're going to make before the 5th of the month, and we advance paid that out to creators who needed it. It was insane. There was bugs in it. We had to fix it. It was tons of cleanup. But when you deploy something in 24 hours. But it was really important to have the cash flow available, to be able to react fast, and sort of keep our promise, because we really didn't. But then March 1st, everything went well. So just a little story.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah. So I mentioned like you have first of the month. That's like the big time for you. And
I'm up 36 hours.
are you really? Yeah.
Yeah.
So
With my team.
Okay, we're not scheduling PAYMENTSfn for first of the month.
Nope,
so
I won't be here.
Okay. So now, Mateus, for yourself, I mean, you have deliveries. A lot of those deliveries are happening late at night, right? So how are you able to scale up and make sure customer service is there, or you're able to process those transactions because they're not 9 to 5, are they?
Well, one thing I learned, all players I learned, is that hungry people are angry people. And the more you make
Guilty.
them wait, it's incredible how much they depend on you. Once a woman called us and said that their children were starving because of us. And it was like, well, don't you have rice in your house? And, well, yeah, our peak hours are lunch and dinner time, especially soccer matches. In LATAM, everybody gets together and they order even more food, and with even more desperation, because they want the food before the game or in the halftime, but not during the game. So it's extremely difficult, and the infrastructure that we need and the customer service that we need has to be optimized to the maximum. And the other thing that is important is to have an internal communication completely smooth when you have like promotions, discounts, or special days for a specific card. We have a monitoring system. It doesn't work perfectly, but it works. And sometimes we noticed a peak in a usage of a specific card or a specific bank-issued card. And we were like, okay, we're having an attack. What's happening? And it was that the marketing team launched a campaign, and they didn't tell us. And that's important for the availability of the service, right. In technical terms, and in terms of operations also, business.
Great. Yeah, that collaboration is definitely a topic I want to come back to. But first, Dan, I mean, we heard from Catherine about Singles Day in China. Yeah. With Spring. Big times of the year as well. So how would you deal with those big scaling times? Like Black Friday.
So Spring as a fashion marketplace increasingly found customers in China were very excited to have access to a lot of the American brands. To Catherine's points, so Singles Day and then Black Friday, of course, were our two biggest days. And I would say two things to call out there from our perspective. One is that it's nice in commerce that it is somewhat predictable. So you can plan, and so we would start planning for Black Friday cross-functionally in May and spend half the year, thinking about it. It was almost as if our entire tech roadmap was, almost to see, because that is our peak stress day. How can we build the things for that? And so, for us, it was making sure we had the right vendors and partners, and one tax computation vendor that shall remain nameless, but you probably all use because they have a bit of monopoly, decided to go down for us on Black Friday about 4 years ago. And so we had to very quickly, in about an hour, figure out how do we just skip collecting sales tax for everyone and just figure it out later and remit whatever we have to remit, but just let's get the orders through. I don't know if any of you were affected by that same outage of that same nameless vendor. So making sure you have those vendors in line. And then for us, sorry to harp on cash flow, but as a marketplace that moved to a 2-transaction model where we were collecting funds from customers and then placing a separate transaction with our brand partner like Nike, we needed to have typically about 5 or 6 business or days of float. So if you think about a day like Black Friday, where you're going to be doing 10 or 15 or 30x your normal day, maybe even 100x, and you start looking at your balance sheet and your cap table, and you're like, oh my goodness, this is like as much money as we've raised. So figuring out what is a good cash flow strategy and how can you maybe get some creative partnerships to allow, especially if any of you are in that 2-transaction marketplace world where you have to pay out your suppliers and float some of that cash, making sure you have a capital planning process for that as well.
Line of credit.
Yeah, I wish we could have gotten a line of credit.
We learned that lesson. just in case.
Now, Fareed, do you see with Ola, is there peak times as well, and how do you handle that?
So I think all online businesses really plan around peaks. We have our peaks, and strangely, they're a bit different in different countries. So for example, in Australia, we have a 4-day peak, and in India, it's typically a weekend peak. Something that I think most of us, and I think there are a lot of technologists and programmers in the room, we dislike doing is throttling. But I think sometimes as you scale a payments business, it's better to throttle because in payments, you don't want your transaction going into ether. You want to make sure that you have actual closure on the transaction, either an approval or a decline, but not knowing what happened to the transaction is very painful and leads to a lot of CS issues. So I think I would certainly, want to obviously try and do my sizing right and make sure I can handle peak volumes. But if I can't, I want to be able to make sure that we can fall back on some throttling.
So, sorry, can I add one more thing? Another thing that we have trouble with, and maybe it's a local thing for Latin, is that not only we have to be careful in peak times when accepting payments, but also with refunds and also chargebacks. Because depending on the bank and the country, sometimes refunds take a lot of time. And again, angry people.
Yeah, it can take up to 30 days in Latin America.
Why you take my money in 10 seconds, but it takes you 4 days to return it to me?
Yeah.
What?
And
And
imagine
sometimes 30.
when you get a chargeback because the person didn't like what they received. So it's an angry refund. Give me back my money right now. So you have to take that into account, that you are going to be accepting transactions and also refunding them very quickly when the restaurant rejects the order, or even in a time frame like, I don't know, 30 days. Yeah.
Great point. That's actually anecdotally, there is a bank who shall remain nameless in India, whose largest merchant was refunds that they never returned to customers until the regulator actually made it mandatory to process refunds. This was 7-8 years ago. It's a much happier state now, but back then, refunds could actually go to bottom lines.
So I have to remember never to do business with a company named Nameless. Is that right? Yeah. Okay, so that's fair. So so the bad side of scaling as well is fraud. How are you dealing with fraud at scale? So Michelle, curious your thoughts on there.
How are we dealing with fraud at scale? So I'll tell a little story. Did anybody use Smite? No? Okay. Smite was our bot detector, and Twitter bought them and shut them down in less than 24 hours and did not alert any of the customers. It was great, right before 4th of July weekend. It was awesome.
Is that a nameless social media company that has a
No,
bird?
I've told them. I will tell them. I was just like, how could you do that to so many people? Luckily, we had others. We didn't have redundancy on the bot, and it took them about 2 days to figure out that we were using Smite and that Smite was down. And we got attacked with about $3 million worth of ATO fraud. It was great. How do I explain that to my executive team? But it also taught us a really good lesson to have redundancy, to use many data points. Don't rely on one. And so our fraud model is mostly built on a lot of third-party vendors that we use. And then also, we just deployed about 2 weeks ago our own machine learning model. And that came out of our July event. It was great it was bad in the sense of the loss that we had, but it was great in the sense that it allowed me to say, hey, we cannot depend only on third-party vendors. They're great inputs. We need to start thinking and actioning on ourselves, and rule-based doesn't always work. And so now we're integrating all of that together to hopefully be better and learn from that mistake and hopefully scale.
Great. Any other?
I think fraud is such an arms race, right, that I think you have to take an honest look at the stage of your company and where your core competencies are and decide, is fraud something that you're going to be really good at? And if so, at what stage? When is it right to start building that machine learning model versus, you know what, we have just hired our 10th engineer or we hired our 20th engineer and we're not going to be good at this compared to what's out there and saying, you know what, let's find a partner who we can integrate with. So having now implemented 2 different fraud vendors, one that was a complete failure and one that was then great, but and just looking at what is an acceptable cost structure. Can we afford half a point of our top line and just outsource this while we scale for the next couple of years and then say, okay, when we actually need that half a point to be 0.1 or 5 basis points, then let's go invest. But I think just being honest with yourself about where your capabilities are and what stage you're at, and hopefully not getting to the point where you're getting letters from Visa and MasterCard saying you owe $300,000 in fees on top of the chargebacks.
Oh yeah, that's not even a chargeback. I mean, yeah.
Those are in
Don't even
excess.
get me started about chargeback programs.
Just to add to what Dan says, I think it's important to know when to make the right investment into fraud detection internally. It is a science at the end of the day, and it's really easy to build ML models. There are various algorithms out there, and it's very tempting for a techie to actually try and say, hey, I can do this. But it really depends on the data. It really depends on how well your system's learned. So you need to probably, like Dan said, right, be prepared to spend 10, 20 basis points for the next 2 years of your life as a startup in this space, or even an established company trying to do business in a new region, just to make sure that you don't get slammed. There is, apart from financial losses, there is significant reputation loss. So, and the other bit of advice that having gone through it a couple of times is that redundancy, like Michelle was saying, right? So it's good to have more than one provider or vendor, and you can figure out what kind of volumes you dial up or dial down. But it's good to have more than one available on tap.
I completely agree with everybody. What we have right now in PayDesha is a complex network of third parties, internal build tools, and we are still struggling because we are never going to be able to solve the fraud problem. If anyone does, please tell us the secret. But what I wanted to add is that this is my favorite topic to argue about in my company. I get invited. Actually, people stopped inviting me to the meetings because they knew I was like. But I took the flag of let's keep fraud low. I mean, fraud is an important topic, and many people in my company didn't take that into account. And even when after 2 years of effort of the team building the fraud detection algorithms, when we got to a good percentage, I mean when the fraud was really low, luckily, in the payments team and in the payments and fraud team, we were really happy. We were congratulating ourselves for a job. And I remember a manager that shall remain nameless also, that said, why do we have so many people in this team and why are we spending so much money in the providers if the fraud rates are so low? And it was like, no, let me start again with every argument we had in the last 3 years. And I actually came to the point, I was very angry, and now I'm laughing, but no. I came to the point that I said, do you want me to turn it off? Let's see. I didn't.
You should have.
But yeah.
So something I've seen that's worked really well, because I think from a fraud and risk perspective, they're the unsung heroes. They will, at least my team, and teams that I've led in that space have always been like, no news is good news, but do we get rewarded on the no news? And how do we show the work that we've done, and how do we showcase that so we don't have to answer that question as to why I have 10 engineers working on our fraud models. And so one of the things I've done at another company that I'm hoping to kind of do here as well at some point is set a monthly threshold of funds that we feel would be okay to lose. So say, I don't know, I'm just making up a number, 1%. We would establish that 1% baseline, and obviously if you're having 1% fraud, you have other issues, but just making it easy, and reserve those funds in the P&L, and then if whatever the delta is, that team gets to keep, and then reinvest into whatever new thing they wanted to think about that's outside of kind of business as usual. And that's really helped them, because they are like, okay, we kind of are in control of our investments. If we can really do a really good job and get smarter around this, we can kind of keep that delta of that budget, and then reinvest it in new teammates, or get into different technologies, or whatever it is. And so I don't know, for me, that's worked in the past team, and I'm evaluating doing that here as well.
Great. Yeah, coming back to the theme on scaling payments and the related fraud that you see, I think it's important to try and get a handle on a metric that is really hard to get a feel for, which is false positives. The really only way to do it that I know of, and Michelle, if you know anything else, let me know, is to try and do a sample and try and understand where you are at, do a litmus test. And I think it's important to keep that metric that'll let you figure out how tight your controls are. You really don't want to be in a position where you're scaling and you're actually still turning away legitimate customers, right?
Yeah, we always have a holdback percent. We also look at CH complaints. So if anybody complains that their card was declined, yeah, I haven't found a perfect solution for it either. Sorry.
That's hard.
Okay, great. Dan, do you have a comment there?
Finding false positives, measuring false positives is hard. I was just re-emphasizing it. I've never seen a great way of doing it.
Right. Okay, great. So I'm going to open up for questions from the audience in just a second, but going back to Michelle, one of your takeaways from this morning was about collaboration between teams internally, and so and also on your point now about motivating your team. So curious how folks in the panel have worked with other teams outside of like the pure payments team, like infrastructure and dev and finance. I know we've got 2 accountants, I think we heard this morning in the audience. So, working with finance is important too, right? So how do you foster those kind of relationships to ensure that when you are scaling and when you do have that first of the month or the singles day or whatever it is, that you've got those foundations in place across the organization?
I'll start with that one. I think there are many developers here, and one of the challenge that we have is that as payments developers is to explain other developers how huge is the unknown in our code, because there's some parts of the code that you control absolutely, but whenever you lose control, whenever you call a provider, what comes back, it's unknown. And you can get an accepted response, a rejected response, or something. No response is still good. But when you get something that you didn't expect, how do you interpret that? How do you work with that? So I also had many arguments. It seems I'm an angry person. I also had many arguments with developers that said like, it's easy, just unit test, do testing, but you never know. You cannot unit test your providers. Mm-hmm. You can be prepared to a certain amount, to a certain level, but you never know what happens. So that's about the relationship between my team technically with our teams. It's like we are really different.
Okay. Just to add to that, I think it's really important for folks in the payments teams to really be invested either as honorary members or somebody who really keeps office hours for compliance, for legal, Information security teams, I think, are really close to you. And product from an experience, because no matter how great your Rails are, if your experience sucks, the whole thing is a goner anyways. So I would certainly make sure that we keep regular office hours for certainly these cross-functional teams that play a huge part in keeping us legit, honest, and doing a great job for our customers.
I was just going to say, as a product manager, I think there's, similar to office hours, I think just being present for those teams in general. I think there's two other ways besides office hours that I've seen be successful. One is having a good, responsive bugs process. And I know it's so tempting to let bugs, slide away, but I think being quick and responsive to a team member who's surfaced a bug is a great way to build that trust. And then the second one is making sure that you're dedicating a portion of your time to internal tools, which again, often make it to the bottom of the roadmap and so on. And they're often less about the business case and more just about the trust and collaboration that they engender by building that tool that then saves someone the 3 hours or 12 hours of spreadsheet hacking in it that they would have to do.
Yeah, I agree with all that's been said, and I can add a little more. I think a large part of my role is just an internal evangelist of helping each team understand the different things that we're doing and how that impacts them, and how the different things that they do impacts us. And so that's always been a huge part of my role, and a lot of what I do is I do all employee onboarding. So I educate all employees on what does the payments team do? We are a payments company, but we're not. And go through that. I spend a lot of time with finance, we're working on being global. We're starting to set up local offices, and they're like, why do we need legal entities? Why do we need revenue centers? And just kind of going through that whole process with them, and then showing like the different types of providers out there that you need a revenue center for or not. How do you think about it? What is the strategy? And so I spend a lot of time with finance, a lot of time with what we call community happenings. Community happenings, which is our call center team and contact support. Anytime we do any change, we walk them through it. We do a lot of lunch and learns. We spend a lot of time educating the company. And then also we bring our partners. We open it up to, hey, you want to do a lunch and learn at our company and tell them what you do for us? And so that also kind of helps. But it's really keeping a line of communication across all the different areas. And I think I've taken it as my responsibility as the head of payments to make sure that every team knows the impact that they have, or I will have impact on them. I don't expect them to all know that.
Great, thank you. So we are coming up on time, but I do want to make sure that we have a chance to get some questions from the audience. So anyone have a question? I did get one through email as well. Justin?
Adam, you referenced a good fraud experience with a vendor and a bad one. So could you tell us about the bad one and give us all the details? No, I'm just kidding. But on what is a good? Can you just walk through a little bit what a good experience with a fraud vendor looks like for people in the audience, maybe thinking about tackling that problem?
A good experience is one where your expectations become reality, is the simple answer. And I think for us, the bad experience was the fraud rates that were way, way, way in excess. We did cross that 1% threshold. Something was wrong. And so then I think being willing to pay for, a number that's a lot less than 1%, but still non-trivial, but knowing that it's predictable and having that predictable line item so that our CFO knows in his annual plan that this is what's going to happen and we just work around it. I think fraud is so unpredictable, but getting to predictability was what made the second experience better, even if it was expensive.
So you reduced fraud, but you also felt like the customer experience stayed largely unchanged. I know false positives are hard to track, but just sort of thinking about the whole overall experience and the trade-offs. Yeah,
it's tricky because, right, a lot of your good customers will never know about your fraud systems. And so I don't have a good answer for that. I think it is one of these unsung hero things where you're not really creating a better customer experience by having a better fraud team, besides by keeping your business in operation and continuing to deliver the product that they want. So yeah.
Yeah, but I would also kind of counter that a little bit.
Yeah.
I think from a marketplace standpoint, protecting your customers from ATOs, account takeovers, and not just the transaction fraud, but just overall account security, that's going to say a lot to in my case, the patron. And then also, we're super susceptible to account takeover just because they know that they pay out creators and there's a balance. So if they can hack a creator account, they switch that payment method, I mean, they can go home with all their earnings. And so it's
So
for me, it's more around that.
On the supply side, it's
On
so
the supply
critical
side,
for that
yeah.
trust. Yeah.
And then also I would say we do tons of manual review. And that's also helped us with, if we're unsure, we'll put you into a queue and a human will look at that internally, our own humans, not external ones. And then we continue to refine based on that. Because for us, yeah, that's kind of like the two things that I would just say that do impact experience that fraud can have an impact. And then refining, will that vendor refine their model based on the insights you are giving them that they are not seeing? And that's something really critical to look at with vendors, at least in my experience.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much to everyone. I really enjoyed the conversation. It was good fun. So thank you again. I know we didn't get a chance to answer all the questions. I did get one through email, but if you please do stop the panelists during the break and continue the conversation. So we have a 20-minute break right now, and we'll reconvene in 20 minutes when you hear the bell and the shouts of the town crier. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.